Hello, everyone. This is the explanation for problem number 4 for practice problem set number 3. And this problem has to do with aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and fiscal and monetary policy. So let's look at it. Suppose the income multiplier is 2 and the income multiplier with respect to money is 3. Now let's analyze what does that mean. Well, as we discussed in class, um, the the government can shift aggregate demand left or right by using either fiscal or monetary policy. And fiscal and monetary policy has a multiplier effect, which means if the government decides to, let's say, change spending, government spending, it will increase aggregate demand, but it's going to increase or decrease aggregate demand by a multiple of the initial increase because of multiple rounds of spending that will go on. I mean, the logic is if the government spends $100 billion, that's $100 billion in the economy. Now, some of that's going to be saved, but some of it's going to be spent. When it's spent, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve again. And some of that money is going to be saved and spent. Well, when it's spent again, it's going to have another impact on aggregate demand. That's the multiplier effect. Now, the same thing goes with money. When the Federal Reserve increases or decreases the money supply, it affects interest rates, and interest rates affects spending on new output, and that shifts aggregate demand curve left or right. And what we're saying is that the multipliers for fiscal policy is 2, and the multiplier for monetary policy is 3. Now, let's look at the second part. Also, the money multiplier is estimated to be 5. Now, this is different than what we've just talked about. The money multiplier is how much will the money supply change when the Federal Reserve increases or decreases excess reserves. That's different than what we've just discussed. This is how much aggregate demand will change when the government changes government spending or taxes, or when the Federal Reserve changes money supply. So one has to do with how much does the aggregate demand curve shift, and the other one has to do with how much the money supply changes. So the government increases spending by $120 billion, but the economy is operating at full capacity. This means that when the government increases spending, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. But since we're already at full capacity, this is going to cause inflationary problems. So the government wants to use monetary policy to offset this increase it will have on inflation. So that's a fancy way of saying the federal government is going to change spending. It's going to increase spending and shift the aggregate curve to the right. Well, what we want is the Federal Reserve to try to offset that and shift it back to the left to not have any impact on inflation. So let's look at option A. Does the central bank need to buy or sell bonds to offset the fiscal policy? Well, I have it right here. Hold on. So the monetary policy must offset the expansionary fiscal policy, so the money supply must be decreased. Now, by decreasing the money supply, that raises interest rates, which will shift the demand curve to the left. That will offset the rightward shift caused by fiscal policy. Now, how does the Federal Reserve do that? Well, they need to sell bonds. When they sell bonds, they take money out of the banking system. When money leaves the banking system, this causes interest rates to go up and the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. So let's get rid of this. So, how many dollars worth of bonds must the central bank buy or sell to accomplish this end? Well, we've already established that they must sell bonds to do this. Now, how much? Well, that comes up to this part. Hold on one second. So, the fiscal policy increases aggregate demand curve by 240 billion. Now, how did I come up with 240 billion? Well, we know the fiscal multiplier is 2, and we know the government increased spending by 120 billion. So we take 120 billion times 2. That's how much aggregate demand curve has shifted to the right. which means that's how much aggregate demand curve has to shift to the left to offset this with monetary policy. Now, here's the next part. So since the money, so the income multiplier with respect to money is 3, that's what we've established up here. To reduce income by 240 billion, the money supply needs to decrease by only 80 billion because of this multiplier. Usually we multiply uh, this, but in this case we're dividing it because we're doing it the opposite. We're taking away money out of the money supply. So how much do we need to decrease or shift the aggregate demand curve to the left by 240 billion? Well, we only have to decrease the money supply by 80 billion. Now, the next part is how much does the federal government actually need in terms of ordering, buying or selling bonds to do this? Well, I got that right here. So therefore, the Fed needs to sell $16 billion worth of bonds. So they're selling bonds, and it takes money out. So basically they're going to take out 16 billion. But when they take out 16 billion, this is going to have a multiplier effect on the money supply. So 16 times 5, which is the money multiplier, is 80 billion. And so this 80 billion is going to decrease demand by 240 billion. So this is how it works. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $16 billion worth of bonds. This is going to have a multiplier effect on the money supply. It's going to cause the money supply to drop by 80 billion. When the money supply drops by 80 billion, this will cause aggregate demand to shift to the left by 240 billion, therefore offsetting the expansionary part of fiscal policy. So there's a number of steps here that come into play, but it all has to do with the multipliers.